They rejected it without opening the folder, not because it was sloppy, not because it was wrong, because it came from him. Malcolm Hayes stood at the circulation desk as the last patrons filtered out, the library lights dimming into their evening glow. He was black, mid-50s, soft-spoken, and officially employed as a night librarian, the kind of position people assumed involved shelving books and keeping homeless patrons awake just enough to move along. Malcolm did all of that, and something else. Every night, after the doors locked and the city quieted, Malcolm worked on an index no one had asked for. The history department at the nearby university had been preparing a massive new textbook, Foundations of the American Century. Grants, panels, white professors with impressive titles debating footnotes in daylight offices. Malcolm never met them, but he read their drafts, not the polished ones, those came later. He read the early research copies that arrived at the library for review. He noticed patterns others didn't, names that appeared once and vanished, events referenced vaguely, then quietly reframed, entire communities that showed up in primary sources but disappeared in synthesis. So he indexed everything, not alphabetically, contextually. He cross-referenced names that never shared a page, matched legislation to local impacts, tracked how language shifted between decades, riot to disturbance to redevelopment. He noted who benefited when terms changed and who vanished when they did. It took him 6 years. He called it the Shadow Index. When the history department announced a call for supplementary materials, Malcolm submitted it, printed, bound, meticulously organized. He even wrote a cover letter. This index connects primary sources already cited in your manuscript, but not cross-examined together. It may help resolve inconsistencies in attribution and omission. The response came 2 weeks later. Polite, brief. Thank you for your interest. At this time, we are not accepting external research from non-affiliated contributors. Non-affiliated. Malcolm folded the letter and slid it into the back of the binder. That night, he returned to work. He didn't argue, he didn't email back, he didn't complain to anyone, because Malcolm knew something they didn't. Historians thought they controlled history because they wrote it, but librarians knew better. They knew history lived in how things were organized, in what was connected, and what was kept apart. 2 months later, a graduate student named Evan Miller requested access to restricted microfilm. White, overworked, clearly behind schedule. "I'm missing something," Evan muttered at the desk. "My advisor says the sources are there, but the narrative doesn't add up." Malcolm looked at him for a moment. Then he reached under the desk and pulled out the binder. "Tell me what you're missing," he said. Evan hesitated. "I'm not supposed to." "You are," Malcolm replied calmly. "You just don't know it yet." As Evan flipped through the index, his face changed. Names lit up, connections formed, contradictions sharpened. This isn't in our drafts," Evan whispered. "No," Malcolm said, "but it's in your sources." That was the moment history shifted, because the index they rejected wasn't an opinion. It was a map, and once someone followed it, the story they thought they were telling would never survive intact again. Evan didn't sleep that night. He sat in his apartment with the binder open on his kitchen table, surrounded by printouts he'd never thought to stack together. Ordinances beside oral histories, census data beside police reports, newspaper headlines next to court transcripts. What Malcolm had built wasn't just an index, it was an accusation. By morning, Evan was back at the library before it opened, waiting by the doors like someone afraid the truth might vanish if he blinked. When Malcolm arrived for his shift, Evan followed him to the desk. "My advisor won't like this," Evan said quietly. Malcolm slid the binder back into its usual place beneath the counter. "Advisors don't like surprises," he replied. "History is full of them anyway." Evan hesitated. "Will you explain how you did it?" Malcolm considered him for a moment, then nodded. "People index to find," he said. "I indexed to reveal." Over the next week, Evan became a regular presence during Malcolm's night shifts. They worked in silence broken only by questions that mattered. Malcolm showed him how language drifted over time to soften violence, how footnotes were used to bury responsibility, how the absence of a cross-reference was often more meaningful than its presence. Meanwhile, the textbook project moved forward. The history department held meetings filled with confident assumptions. White professors debated tone, scope, marketability. They congratulated themselves on being inclusive while unknowingly relying on structures that had excluded the same stories for decades. Then Evan submitted his chapter revision. The reaction was immediate. "This reframes the entire section," his advisor said, flipping pages too fast. "Where is this coming from?" "The sources you approved," Evan replied. "I just connected them." A senior professor frowned. "These interpretations are aggressive." "They're consistent," Evan said. "They asked for citations. He gave them dozens, everyone already in their bibliography. That was the problem. The department split. Some dismissed Evan's work as overreach, others couldn't unsee what had been pointed out. Quiet arguments spilled into hallways. Drafts were rewritten, then rewritten again. One professor accused another of retroactive guilt. The editor overseeing the textbook requested a meeting. Evan brought the binder. They rejected it again, formally this time. Too disruptive, too political, too late in the process. Evan walked out of the meeting shaken. That night, he returned to the library. "They don't want it," he said to Malcolm. "They say it changes too much." Malcolm nodded. "It always does." "What do I do?" Evan asked. Malcolm paused, then reached for a different folder. Thinner, older. "You don't fight a closed door," he said. "You change which door people notice." Inside the folder were circulation logs, acquisition records, interlibrary loan data, evidence of how widely the primary sources already travelled without being synthesized, proof that the story was already there, scattered and unread. "You publish the index," Malcolm said, "not as a textbook, as a tool." Evan stared at him. "They'll hate that." Malcolm smiled faintly. "They already do." Because the night librarian knew something the department was only beginning to learn, you don't have to rewrite history to change it. You just have to rearrange it so the truth can no longer hide. The reaction came faster than either of them expected. Evan published the index online as a searchable database, clean interface, no commentary, no opinionated framing, just links, cross-references, timelines that quietly lined up events scholars had always treated as unrelated. He didn't call it the Shadow Index, he called it Supplemental Reference, a cross-contextual tool. Neutral enough to slip past defenses, it didn't. Within 48 hours, historians started sharing it privately. At first, with curiosity, then with discomfort, then with urgency. Emails hit Evan's inbox at all hours. "Where did this come from? Who built this? Why haven't I seen these connections before?" Some messages were careful, others weren't. One white professor wrote bluntly, "This reframes agency in ways that are deeply inconvenient." That was the point. At the university, the textbook committee went into damage control. They released a statement distancing themselves from the index, calling it an external tool not affiliated with our publication. They emphasized that the textbook remained peer-reviewed and balanced. Balanced had become the word they used when something felt threatened. But balance didn't survive contact with the index. Graduate students began citing it, not as a source, but as a method. Professors noticed seminar discussions shifting. Students stopped accepting vague transitions and started asking why certain events were isolated on the page. A question appeared on an exam review board. How does reframing source adjacency alter historical accountability? No one could trace where it came from. In the library, Malcolm kept working nights. No interviews, no announcements. But he noticed the change. Students no longer skimmed indexes. They studied them. Some asked Malcolm questions, not about where books were, but about how they were connected. A few noticed patterns on their own and came back excited, unsettled. One evening, a white senior professor approached the desk, binder in hand. "I hear you're the one who built this," she said quietly. Malcolm didn't deny it. He didn't confirm it either. "I organized materials already in the collection," he said. "Nothing more." She hesitated. "It's forcing revisions." Malcolm nodded. "Indexes do that." The pressure intensified when a journalist picked up the story, not as controversy, but as curiosity. Who decides what history connects to what? The article didn't name Malcolm, but it quoted a librarian. History isn't rewritten by adding facts. It's rewritten by changing how facts sit next to each other. That quote travelled. By the end of the semester, the publisher delayed the textbook release. Officially for structural review, unofficially because entire chapters no longer held together. The index had exposed seams no one could stitch back invisibly. At a closed meeting, one professor slammed the table. "This was built by a librarian," he said, "at night." Silence followed, because no one could argue with what that librarian had built. They had rejected the night librarian because they believed authority came from authorship, not arrangement. Because they underestimated the power of someone who spent years watching how information moved when no one thought it mattered. They were learning, slowly and painfully, that history doesn't just live in books, it lives in how books are ordered. And once that order changes, the story can never go back to pretending it was neutral. The textbook never came out the way they planned. What was supposed to be a definitive volume became a moving target. Chapters rewritten, sections postponed, language softened and then hardened again as reviewers argued over responsibility, framing, and omission. Every time they tried to settle on a final version, someone would quietly open the index, and everything unravelled again. The publisher eventually did what institutions always do when control slips. They adapted without admitting why. A revised edition was announced, new contributors added, a broader advisory board assembled. The language in the press release shifted from authoritative to evolving. Inside the acknowledgements, near the end where few readers linger, appeared a single new line. "We thank the library staff whose organisational insights informed structural revisions." No names. Malcolm didn't need one. At the library, his nights continued much the same. The hum of fluorescent lights, the soft click of keyboards, the quiet presence of people who came looking for answers they couldn't find online. But something had changed. Graduate students requested index consultations. Visiting scholars asked about catalogue logic. A workshop was proposed, indexing as interpretation. It filled up in hours. One evening, Evan returned, older now somehow, more certain. "They're teaching it," he said quietly. "The method." Malcolm looked up from reshelving a cart. "Good. They don't say where it came from." Malcolm smiled faintly. "That's how you know it worked." Months later, a new history text appeared in classrooms. Not perfect, not radical, but undeniably different. Events that once stood alone were now placed side by side. Footnotes pointed outward instead of inward. Readers were invited, not instructed, to see patterns. Students noticed. Questions changed. The Night Librarian's Index didn't replace history. It changed how history was approached. One late night, as Malcolm prepared to lock up, a young student paused at the desk. "Why do indexes matter so much?" she asked. Malcolm thought for a moment. "Because stories don't change when you add a chapter," he said. "They change when you change what sits next to what." She nodded, thoughtful, and walked out into the dark. They had rejected the Night Librarian because they thought his work was mechanical, secondary, invisible. Because they believed history was written by those whose names appeared on covers, not by those who made sense of the shelves. They were wrong, because long after arguments fade and authors are debated, the way knowledge is organised determines what the next generation sees first, and what they might finally question. And somewhere in that quiet space between books, under dim lights after midnight, a man they overlooked had rewritten the story without ever writing a single chapter.